Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Contours podcast series. I'm your host for today, Eugene Chausovsky, and I'll be talking to my colleagues Milos Majori and Andrew Loftusness about some of the key developments this week related to geopolitical hotspots and their implications on global connectivity themes like trade, technology, energy, and climate. A more in-depth analysis and forecast of these topics can be found in the weekly forecast monitor that New Lines publishes every Friday. The weekly forecast monitor examines various forecast scenarios for geopolitical hotspots around the world and the risks and opportunities that such scenarios can entail. So Milos, it's been another very eventful week. What are some of the most important developments that you've been tracking this week?
Yeah, so this week all eyes are on Iran as the United States continued its military buildup of naval and air forces near the country for a potential military operation. All the while, Iranian officials have been reporting progress in diplomatic talks with the US. Then shifting to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, both countries have concluded negotiations in Switzerland with so far inconclusive results, while world leaders gathered in Germany for the 62nd Munich Security Conference. In the Indo-Pacific, the US unveiled plans to deploy further missile systems to the Philippines, while China is getting ready to receive German Chancellor Friederich Merz. And then finally, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio here in the Western Hemisphere has been in talks with the Cuban government as US forces have captured another Venezuelan-linked tanker in the Indian Ocean. So lots to get into.
Great, thanks, Milos. So let's start off, as you mentioned, with Iran and in the Middle East. And I should note to our listeners that we're recording this podcast on the morning of Thursday, February 19th. So we're in a very fast-moving situation here. But right now, we're very much on watch for military action out of the U.S. on Iran and some associated diplomatic and hybrid developments that are taking place around this theater. So, Andrew, why don't you first start us off with some of the military updates related to this hotspot?
Right. So at the same time as U.S. and Iranian diplomats were meeting in Geneva for mediations with the Omanis, the U.S. was continuing a significant military buildup in the region, of course, staging for a potential military intervention against Iran. Now, just to put things into context, the current U.S. military presence in CENTCOM, to use DoD parlance, is the largest since the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. So specifically just before U.S. forces went in and crossed the line of departure, to quote General Mattis at the time, for the invasion of Iraq. A few important differences here, of course, that included significant ground forces that is at present not part of this potential campaign. Despite the size of the forces currently off Iran's shores right now, this is a smaller fleet and armada, to quote the president, than the U.S. assembled in its international coalition for Operation Desert Storm. Now, in Operation Desert Storm, that bombardment consisted of the largest coalition in terms of nations contributing aircraft and pilots in history. A significant difference here is that if President Trump gives the order for the U.S. to attack Iran, it will almost certainly do so alone, with the likely exception of Israeli Air Force pilots. Now, the United States, of course, has taken decisive, if not limited, military action against Iran in the recent past under President Trump. I'm referring, of course, to Trump's first term when the U.S. assassinated Qasem Soleimani, and of course, most recently when the U.S. bombed Iranian nuclear facilities inside Iran itself. Now, another significant difference between those past operations to be aware of is that the U.S. is now publicly declaring that it is postured to sustain operations against Iran for several weeks, potentially months. Now, if the president gives the order to proceed with an attack, we don't know right now what that bombardment campaign. We would presumably know shortly after the attack begun what the U.S. is trying to achieve. But right now, we do not know for certain if the U.S. would just be trying to get Iran to make major concessions at the negotiating table, if they would try to destroy completely its nuclear as well as conventional weapons programs, or of course, a likely scenario if the U.S. would try to achieve regime collapse inside of Iran. Okay, so a few more details for listeners to be aware of. Keep in mind when during the war between Israel and Iran last May, Israel essentially by itself, I'm certain there was some level of operational or intelligence support from the United States, but Israel essentially by itself was able to completely dominate Iran's airspace. The assets that the U.S. currently have in the region and that it is capable of deploying from the United States on very short notice dwarf the Israeli capabilities, both in terms of simply the number of assets and in capability. Now, at the same time, the Iranian government is taking obviously a very defiant stance. The Supreme Leader has said that any efforts from the United States to bring down his government are doomed to fail. The IRGC has been carrying out a number of drills in the last few days, in particular naval drills, and there was a joint statement very recently from out of both Tehran and Moscow saying that the Russian and Iranian navies are scheduled to begin military drills this week, so presumably within the next couple of days, in the Gulf of Oman, as well as in the Gulf of Oman, as well as the Indian Ocean. Now, a couple other indicators to keep our eye on. I've seen reports that Germany is moving its military forces out of Iraq in anticipation for a war between the U.S. and Iran and the regional fallout that would almost certainly happen as a result. Those German forces, to my understanding, are currently around Erbil in Iraqi Kurdistan. And the Polish Prime Minister has recently released a statement saying that conflict is almost imminent, is at least very realistic, and was urging Polish citizens inside Iran to, quote, leave Iran immediately.
Right, so we're clearly seeing a very high degree of military escalation, or at least the potential for military escalation between the U.S. and Iran right now. I should also note that unnamed U.S. officials have said that those U.S. strikes could happen as soon as this weekend, around February 21st and 22nd. So yes, clearly a lot of activity that's leading up to a potential military campaign here. And as you noted, Andrew, there's a lot of regional and even to some extent global ripple effects and reactions. So you already noted the joint drills that Russia and Iran have announced, and some of the European countries and other states pulling back some of their diplomats in anticipation of an Iranian reaction, not only against countries like Israel, but also potentially against U.S. bases throughout the region. Are there any other important regional or global reactions that you would want to note or things to watch for as we move forward into the next few days?
China, for its part, is, of course, urging restraint and a policy of non-intervention. Something for listeners to be aware of is that 80% of Iranian oil exports currently go to China. And, of course, that situation could change drastically in the case of course, regime collapse, or even short of that, just a sustained U.S. air campaign against Iranian energy infrastructure.
Right, and also I should note that global oil prices have started to tick up over the past few days as a result of this news, and that Strait of Hormuz, which you had mentioned earlier, Andrew, in terms of those IRGC exercises, is a vital global energy choke point where supplies not only from Iran, but also from major energy producers and exporters like Saudi Arabia and the UAE travel through. So any conflict, depending on how intense it gets, could have a pretty significant impact, not only regionally, but also in terms of global energy supplies and broader economic ripple effects. So clearly a lot to pay attention to here. There is ongoing diplomatic activity, but we do seem to right now be trending highly towards military escalation. So we'll be sure to update in our next podcast. And before we leave the Middle East, were there any other updates that you wanted to mention, Andrew, particularly as it relates to the Gaza theater?
Definitely. One final note, though, on your last comment there, Eugene, about the possibility of a diplomatic outcome. Completely agree that it is possible. One thing I'll add on to that is that in the past, Trump has ordered military operations and then rescinded that order very quickly, particularly against Iran. So we'll certainly keep our eye on that for the next few hours and going into this weekend. But turning now to Gaza, Trump's Board of Peace is hosting its first official meeting today, February 19th. Trump himself, of course, is the chair for that meeting. There are two major points of discussion on the table. The first is reconstruction efforts for Gaza, which Trump is claiming various nations. He has not specified who, and I have not seen any claims as of the time of recording, but have contributed $5 billion towards his senior advisor and son-in-law Jared Kushner's proposed reconstruction plan for the Gaza Strip. The second item, at least as important, perhaps more so, is the UN-backed International Stabilization Force. Now, on paper, this stabilization force was supposed to exist and be deployed and be operational before the ceasefire transitioned into phase 2. That's phase 2 out of 3. And this is where we see some contention between the U.S. and Israel, kind of like we've been discussing over the last couple of weeks, where Trump is adamant that Gaza and the entire plan is now in phase 2 of implementation, and the Israelis officially, publicly disagree wholeheartedly. The current issue holding back the not just the formation but the implementation of an international stabilization force is, of course, the fact that Hamas has not disarmed. There is currently a complete resurgence of Hamas control on the ground in Gaza and the portions of the territory that the IDF has withdrawn from on the other side of the so-called yellow line. And until that problem is resolved, either diplomatically or through force, as is likely, as we've discussed recently, through a renewed Israeli offensive, then, of course, it will simply be impossible to move on to Trump's much-anticipated reconstruction plan of the territory.
Got it. So lots to pay attention to there on the Gaza front. And let's move on now to our second global hotspot of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where, as with Iran, we've seen a lot of diplomatic activity, but also some degree of military action as well. So what can you update us, particularly on the diplomatic front, Andrew?
Right. A significant amount of diplomatic news this week on most of the areas that we're tracking. Coming out of Geneva, once again, 2 days of direct negotiations between Ukraine and Russia just concluded. Those negotiations, of course, were mediated by the United States, specifically Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner playing a very direct role. Coming out of those meetings, we've seen an interesting mix of reactions. The Ukrainians and Zelensky himself described the results as insufficient or inconclusive. At the same time, and this is notable, he said that progress has been made over the proposed monitoring mechanism of a potential ceasefire. Of course, that's significant, but a couple of steps ahead because, again, according to comments from Zelensky and others, there has been no progress so far made over the issue of the future control of the Donbass region in Zaporizhia as well. Zelensky yesterday reiterated his stance that Ukraine will not cede land in the Donbass that it currently holds. Another round of talks is currently being scheduled. All parties seem committed to proceeding. The White House has said that there is, quote, meaningful progress, and Russia's lead negotiator, Vladimir Medinsky, described the talks as, quote, difficult but businesslike. So again, not too many details coming out of what that monitoring mechanism might look like, but I will note that this general trend of a change in tone from the American, Russian, and Ukrainian officials involved has continued to these ongoing talks in Geneva.
Gotcha. And in the backdrop of those Russia-Ukraine talks, we also had a very notable hosting of the Munich Security Conference in Germany, which touched on a lot of those issues, but also broader U.S.-EU security ties. So Milos, what can you update us in terms of the main developments from that conference?
Well, so as always, Germany did indeed host the Munich Security Conference this year. And this year was marked by a couple different events which sort of made it stand out. The first of which was the speech given by the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, which was seen by many as an extension of a sort of olive branch by the United States to Europe, specifically in light of not only the events surrounding Greenland earlier this year, but also in light of, in contrast, I should say, to J.D. Vance's speech at last year's Munich Security Conference, which was quite almost perceived as antagonistic by a lot of European countries, putting into question the whole relationship. So this year, Rubio did seem to adopt a more reconciliatory position towards Europe, but still maintaining a firm position, especially on this ideology of defending Western civilization that unites both the United States and Europe. Along with that, a few items of note was also the outreach made by U.S. lawmakers, and specifically two that stood out was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Gavin Newsom, both of whom tried to, in their own way, also extend an arm to Europe, with Cortez gathering several roundtable meetings about countering the rise of authoritarianism across the world, and Gavin Newsom signing deals with the United Kingdom and Germany with regards to continued cooperation with regards to the energy transition and climate cooperation. So nevertheless, though, there is skepticism remaining amongst Europeans concerning the extent of the US's commitments to traditional alliances, and obviously the transatlantic alliance. And obviously the Danish and Greenlandic prime ministers were both attending, and both were the first to declare that the issue on Greenland's status is far from over, and that negotiations are continuing, and that still is a bit of a cloud looming over the transatlantic alliance. And I should say the last thing I'll mention on this conference was the appearance of Chinese officials who seem to want to really counter the US's position, and talked highly about the fact that China and Europe can be these two pillars within a continued world of multilateralism and liberal cooperation, and seemingly reaching out a lot further. And we've seen this trend emerge over the past couple of months, and actually since Trump came back into office. So definitely a trend that's likely going to continue.
Right. And that's actually a good segue to our next global hotspot of the Indo-Pacific. So as you mentioned, a lot of activity happening between China and Europe, and where the US fits in with that relationship. So what can you update us on some of the economic and diplomatic activity that we've been seeing on this front?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, this was a good sort of example of these trends emerging, where China's really trying to fill in the gaps that the US is leaving behind. And this is something that a lot of people have talked about for the past year, but with Europe, it certainly seems to come to the fore, at least rhetorically. To name but some examples, this week, actually, the German Chancellor Friederich Merz, he announced that he will be traveling to China next week, but crucially that he wanted to secure, and I'm quoting him here, strategic partnerships with Beijing. So not many details there, but we can assume that topics of note are going to be the automotive industry, especially, as well as cooperation on critical minerals. And we are seeing a shift back towards European countries kind of understanding that in light of the economic uncertainty and, possibly strategic uncertainty posed by the Trump administration, that they do have to hedge their bets and reach back out to China. Germany was always the most reluctant, it seemed, of the European countries to divest away from China. So this will likely be seen as a diplomatic victory within the Chinese circles. Another element that sort of follows on from a story we covered in previous episodes, we know that recently the United Kingdom was a country to also have visited, the Prime Minister of the UK visited China recently, as did the Prime Minister of Canada. and both of them trying to thaw out relations, trying to reestablish those economic partnerships. And as a response this week, a notable development we saw from China's side was that it's added Canada and the UK to the list of countries whose citizens can enter China without a visa for a limited duration. And it should be noted that a lot of European countries are already on this list, with the United States being the global exception. With regards to the US and China themselves, that we haven't seen too many developments this week, other than some data from specifically the port of Los Angeles, trades data, which showed that exports to China have actually been falling around 8% in January, which marked its lowest monthly output in the past 3 years. So quite an interesting development there, and it should be said that it's part of a wider trend that has seen the US trade deficit not necessarily decreasing as fast as I suspect the Trump administration wants it to. So definitely trade numbers that we're keeping an eye on as the year progresses.
Got it. And in the meantime, we've been seeing some notable security developments related to the US, Philippines, and Japan. So what can you update us there?
Yeah, indeed. So we will be hearing more about this, but we know that there are upcoming exercises, bilateral exercises between the United States and the Philippines taking part in April. And these are annual exercises, so no major escalation there. The major difference this year is that Japan will be joining these exercises for the first time as well. And we got the news from Japan that they will be deploying around 300 elite troops to take part in the drills, marking a total of around 5,000 troops overall taking part in this exercise. I should note also that Australia will also be adding itself to these drills for the first time. But it is interesting that Japan has made this announcement. From a technical perspective, Japan brings some experience that Philippines has been trying to build up, including a specialization in literal combat capabilities, but also the organizational structure in general, including command and control capabilities that Japan has quite highly. And the move obviously comes amid rising tensions between China and Japan, as Japan seeks to increase its defensive readiness. So any move of the sort is likely to set off some alarm bells in China. And then sort of tangentially related, we also got a joint statement from the US and the Philippines on a separate event, which has to do with plans to deploy more missile systems to the Philippines. And the last time we heard something about this was in 2024, towards the end of the year, where the US had previously deployed mid-range Typhoon missile systems to the Philippines. And that had drawn strong condemnation from Beijing and even requests to remove the systems, requests which were not heeded by Manila. So, we don't know, again, the full extent of what these plans are, but we'll likely be hearing, in the next couple of months, talks of potentially an increased arms sales to the Philippines from the United States. So keeping an eye on that as well.
Got it. Thanks. And then finally, there was a notable AI-related development out of India this week. So what can you update us there?
Yeah, just an interesting tech news item where India hosted the AI Impact Summit in New Delhi. This saw around 100 CEOs from various tech companies, AI companies, including OpenAI, Anthropic, as well as Microsoft, to name but a few. And this was hailed by India as quite an achievement. They want to reposition themselves as a strong AI player on the global stage. We know that back in 2024, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced an increase in funding to be spent on the country's AI capabilities. But that was heavily substantiated this week by an investment group in India, announcing a $100 billion investment pledge in the construction of new data centers to be spent over the next 9 years. So, not quite yet on the level of funding and data set capability, the same level as the US or China, but certainly we're starting to see a lot of startups coming to the fore, as well as an increased ability to develop their own large language models. So, this is just an item to keep a watch on as the year progresses.
Thanks. So we'll have to leave it there. Before we wrap up, are there any other hotspots that you wanted to mention from this past week, Milos?
Yeah, so just bringing our attention back locally to the US and developments in the Caribbean. So Pressure by the US on Cuba has been mounting. The island has been facing increasingly difficult situations, not only power faults in healthcare services, but also as a result of those power halts, we've been seeing, trash building up in the streets, to name but a few things that the country's been facing. President Trump has reiterated his warnings to Cuba to make a deal, and he has confirmed that Marco Rubio is in discussions with the Cuban government. And he has said that it was probably unnecessary to conduct a military operation similar to the one that was conducted against Venezuela back in January. However, we have been seeing, continued pressure by the US on the sort of military enforcement sides. And this week we got news that US forces boarded a sanctioned oil tanker that was linked to Venezuela in the Indian Ocean. And this is part of the US's efforts to control Venezuelan oil, though I should say that no statement has been made as of yet whether the tanker has formally been placed under US control. So just the hotspot that we're keeping an eye on at the moment.
Understood. So we'll have to wrap up here. If you'd like more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to the topics that we discussed, please check out the weekly forecast monitor on our website at newlinesinstitute.org, where you can also register to receive our weekly newsletter and access to our geopolitical forecasting platform for real-time updates and analysis around the world. Thank you, Milos. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you all for listening, and take care.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.